The final turning of the key in the lock of the life she had known was a sound so small it was swallowed by the wind. Alara stood on the porch of the farmhouse, the wood groaning under the weight of a coming winter, and watched the dust motes dance in the slanted afternoon light. Each one was a tiny ghost of a shared laugh, a whispered secret, a life lived and now, abruptly, unlived. Liam was gone. The words were simple, 4 of them, yet they were a chasm into which her world had fallen. He had been the farm, and the farm had been him. Now both were hollowed out, echoes in a landscape that had already begun to forget their song. The earth, she knew, was not sentimental. It took what was given and moved on. She was not a landowner. She was a widow. In the cold calculus of the law and family tradition, the distinction was everything. The farm, the house, the fields that rolled away like a sleeping green sea, all of it belonged to Liam's blood, not to the woman who had poured her own sweat and soul into its soil. That blood ran thick and cold in Thomas, Liam's younger brother. He had arrived 2 days after the funeral, his car a sleek black Beetle against the rustic browns and greens of the countryside. He did not wear his grief openly. He wore it like a well-tailored suit, something to be presented, acknowledged, and then used to get down to business. He had stood in the kitchen where she and Liam had planned their future, his polished shoes scuffing the worn linoleum. He had a ledger with him. Not a metaphorical one, but a real leather-bound book filled with columns and figures that reduced a lifetime of labor to a series of debts and assets. Liam, it turned out, had been more of a poet than a businessman. The farm was leveraged, mortgaged, and, in Thomas's estimation, failing. "I'm sorry, Alara," he had said, the words smooth and practiced, "but the bank will take it. There's nothing to be done. I'm liquidating what I can to settle his accounts. It's for the best, to protect the family name." He spoke of the family name as if it were a fragile heirloom he was rescuing from a fire she had set. He offered her a small sum, a pittance he called a gesture of goodwill, enough to get her to the nearest city and disappear. "You have until the first snow," he declared, his voice leaving no room for argument. "After that, this place is no longer your concern." The first snow. In this part of the country, that was not a gentle promise of winter festivities. It was a threat. It could come in a week or a month, but when it came to conquer. It buried roads, broke branches, and froze the very marrow in your bones. It was a deadline enforced by nature itself. So she stood on the porch, an exile in her own home, and looked out at what was left. Not much. Thomas, in his cruel accounting, had offered her one final mocking piece of the estate. "You can have the old north barn," he'd said with a thin smile. "And the acre it sits on. It's worthless. The foundation is cracked, and the land is too rocky to plow. Consider it a parting gift." He had signed a quitclaim deed on the spot, the scratch of his pen a final act of severance. The north barn stood apart from the main cluster of buildings, a skeletal silhouette against the bruised pewter sky. It was the farm's first barn, built by a grandfather whose name was now just a carving on a stone. It had been left to decay for 50 years, a forgotten relic. The wind sang a mournful tune through its missing slats, and the roof sagged in the middle like the spine of an old tired horse. It was, by any rational measure, an insult. A pile of rotting wood on an acre of stones, worthless. But it was hers, the only thing in the entire world that was. She walked toward it, her boots sinking into the damp earth that smelled of rain and decay. The air was getting colder, the kind of cold that felt ancient and personal. The community, the loose collection of families that dotted the valley, had offered their condolences. They had brought casseroles and pies, their faces etched with a pity that felt heavier than her grief. They saw her as a tragic figure. The outsider who had married in, lost her husband too young, and was now being cast out by his practical family. They whispered about her. What will she do? Where will she go? Their concern was a cage of its own. As she reached the barn, the sheer scale of its decrepitude was overwhelming. The great doors hung askew on rusted hinges. Weeds grew thick and tangled around the stone foundation. Yet, as she pushed one of the doors open with a groan of protest, a strange sense of peace settled over her. Inside, the air was still and smelled of hay that had long since turned to dust, of earth, and of animal life. A small flock of feral sheep, descendants of a forgotten herd, had claimed the space as their own. They watched her with placid yellow eyes from the far corner, their wool thick and matted. They were survivors. She was not a fool. She knew what the coming winter meant. Without four walls, a solid roof, and a reliable source of heat, survival was not a given. The small sum from Thomas would not be enough for a deposit on an apartment in the city, let alone a life. She had nothing but this wreck and the stony ground beneath it. Desperation was a cold, clear lens. It stripped away sentiment and left only the raw mechanics of staying alive. Her eyes traced the lines of the barn, the massive posts and beams, hewn by hand a century ago. They were weathered but solid. The structure was failing, but it was not yet fallen. Liam had told her once that the old-timers built things to argue with the wind, not to surrender to it. He had loved this old barn, had spoken of restoring it someday. A dream that, like so many others, was now just another ghost. She made her way to the back, to a set of warped wooden stairs that led down into darkness. The root cellar. Every old farm had one. A hole in the ground, lined with stone, where the earth's own steady temperature kept the harvest from freezing or rotting. She pulled a long match from her pocket, struck it against the rough wood of the wall, and descended. The air changed instantly. The biting wind vanished, replaced by a cool, damp stillness. The temperature was at least 15 degrees warmer than it was outside. It was the breath of the deep earth, a constant, unwavering presence that ignored the seasonal wars waged on the surface. The cellar was small, no more than 10 feet by 10 feet, the stone walls slick with moisture. A few rotted shelves clung to one wall. It was a tomb, a forgotten space. She stood in the center, the match flickering, casting dancing shadows on the stones. She looked up. Through the thick, dusty floorboards of the barn above, she could hear the soft shuffling of the sheep. A low bleat. The faint, earthy scent of them drifted down, and with it something else. A subtle, pervasive warmth. It was not a blast of heat, but a constant low-grade energy. The cumulative warmth of living bodies, trapped in the enclosed space of the barn. That's when the first piece of the idea clicked into place. It wasn't a lightning bolt of genius, but a quiet observation, born of desperation and a memory. Her grandfather, a man who had lived through the Great Depression, had been a master of using what others threw away. He used to talk about the heat generated by his compost pile, how it could keep seedlings from freezing even on a frosty spring morning. He called it manure heat, the slow, steady fire of decomposition. The ground beneath the sheep was a thick, packed layer of old hay, droppings and earth, a composting mattress that had been building for years. It was generating heat. The sheep themselves were generating heat. The earth beneath her feet was holding its own deep geothermal warmth. 3 sources of steady, reliable heat, all concentrated in one place. Worthless. The word echoed in her mind, Thomas's voice dripping with condescension. He had seen a pile of rotting wood. The townspeople saw a widow's folly. But here, in the cold, dark earth, Alara began to see a solution. It was a mad thought, the kind of plan that only takes root in a mind that has no other options left. She would not live in the barn. She would live under it. She would expand this cellar, dig herself a shelter out of the very earth that everyone else had deemed useless. She would harness the gentle, persistent warmth of the life above to keep the frost away. She would become a creature of the earth. because the surface world had cast her out. The decision, once made, settled in her bones with the weight of stone. It was terrifying and liberating all at once. The next morning, she took the bulk of Thomas's goodwill money and went to the town's hardware store. She did not buy lumber or insulation or a new wood stove. She bought a heavy-duty pickaxe, a second shovel, a dozen buckets, a good lantern, and 100 feet of rope. The proprietor, Mr. Harris, looked at her purchases, then at her, his eyes a mixture of curiosity and pity. "Long winter ahead," he said. A statement, not a question. Ilara simply nodded. The longest. Her purchase was the talk of the town by noon. The widow's gone strange, they said over coffee at the diner. Buying digging tools when she should be finding a place to live. The narrative was solidifying. She was not just tragic anymore. She was becoming unhinged by her grief. Her first day of labor was a brutal education. The ground in the cellar was compacted and threaded with a network of stubborn roots. The pickaxe felt alien in her hands, a clumsy tool of percussion. Each swing sent a jarring shock up her arms and into her shoulders. The sound of metal striking stone rang out in the subterranean quiet. She worked until her hands were raw, blisters forming and then breaking, leaving tender pink skin exposed. By the end of the day, she had managed to loosen a patch of earth no bigger than a welcome mat. She hauled the dirt out, bucket by bucket, dumping it in a growing pile behind the barn, hidden from the road. That night she slept in the hayloft, wrapped in a threadbare blanket she'd salvaged from the farmhouse. The wind howled through the walls, a constant reminder of her deadline. She was cold, her muscles screaming in protest. But for the first time since Liam's death, she felt a flicker of something other than loss. It was a hard, sharp-edged thing. Determination. Days bled into weeks. A routine formed, dictated by the rising and setting of the sun. She would wake at dawn, her body stiff and aching, and descend into the earth. The work was methodical, relentless. Swing the pickaxe, pry the loosened earth with the shovel, fill the bucket, haul it up, dump it, and repeat. Her body changed. The soft lines of her former life were planned away, replaced by hard, wiry muscle. Her hands, perpetually calloused and stained with dirt, became tools in their own right. The pile of excavated earth behind the barn grew from a mound into a small hill. The room below was slowly, painstakingly expanding. She was not just digging a hole. She was sculpting a space. She learned to read the earth, the subtle shifts from soft loam to dense clay, the frustrating discovery of a boulder that would take days to dig around. She worked with a quiet, focused intensity that left no room for grief or fear. There was only the next swing of the pick, the next bucket of dirt. One afternoon, a shadow fell across the cellar entrance. She looked up, blinking against the light, to see Silas, her neighbor to the west. He was a tall, weathered man in his 60s, his face a roadmap of hard seasons. He held a thermos in one hand and a covered basket in the other. "Figured you could use this," he said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't wait for an invitation, but climbed down the rickety stairs, his movements sure and steady. He surveyed her work, his gaze taking in the excavated space, the piles of stone, the tools worn bright from use. His expression was unreadable. "Ilara," he began, his tone gentle, like he was talking to a spooked animal. "What in God's name are you doing?" "I'm building my home," she replied, her voice hoarse from disuse. He shook his head slowly, a deep sigh escaping his lips. "This isn't a home. It's a grave. The frost line here goes 4 feet deep. The cold will seep through these walls and kill you in your sleep. No one can winter in a hole in the ground." "It won't freeze," she said, a simple statement of fact. "The sheep." Silas looked up at the floorboards, then back at her. The pity was back in his eyes, deeper this time. He thought she had truly lost her mind. "A handful of sheep can't heat the whole earth, girl." "That's not how it works." He opened the basket. "My wife sent some stew." And bread. You need to eat. But you need to stop this folly. I have a spare room. You're welcome to it until you get on your feet. She was touched by his kindness, but stung by his dismissal. Thank you for the food, Silas. But I'm staying here. He argued for a while longer, his practical farmer's logic colliding with her strange, desperate faith. He spoke of insulation values, of BT us, of the brutal, unforgiving physics of a northern winter. She listened politely but did not waver. Finally, he gave up, leaving the thermos and basket on a flat stone. He climbed out of the cellar, pausing at the top. Don't let your grief make you stubborn, Ilara. The winter doesn't care why you're not prepared. His visit was a turning point. The whispers in town now had an eyewitness account. The story grew more fantastical. They said she was digging to the center of the earth. They called her the Mole Woman. Children would ride their bikes down the long dirt road to her barn, daring each other to peek inside, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mad widow in her burrow. She ignored them all. Their mockery was a distant noise, like the wind in the trees. It couldn't touch her in the quiet focus of her work. She began shoring up the walls of her expanding cavern. She scavenged wood from the collapsing sections of the barn, prying loose, thick oak planks that were gray with age but still strong. She learned to brace them against the earthen walls, creating a crude but sturdy framework. The space began to feel less like a cave and more like a room. A subterranean, troglodytic room, but a room nonetheless. She carved niches into the clay walls for candles and her few belongings. She built a low sleeping platform from the smoothest planks. The most crucial part of her plan was the final piece: the pipe. She had spent a day searching the farm's junk pile, a graveyard of rusted equipment and forgotten projects. There she found it, a 10-foot section of old stovepipe, 4 inches in diameter. It was dented but intact. It took her the better part of a day to clean it, and another 2 days to install it. She carefully drilled a hole through the thick floorboards of the barn, directly above the center of her new room. The sheep scattered at the strange noise, watching her with wary curiosity. Then, from below, she pushed the pipe up through the floor. It rose about a foot into the barn, into the heart of the area where the sheep spent their nights. The bottom end of the pipe hung down into her cellar, about 5 feet from the floor. It was a simple, almost laughably primitive ventilation system. Her theory was that the warmer, lighter air from the sheep enclosure, a mixture of their collective body heat and the radiant warmth from the composting floor, would naturally be drawn down the pipe into the colder, denser air of her cellar. It was a gentle, continuous exchange, a slow, silent transfusion of warmth. As autumn deepened, the nights grew colder. The first hard frosts silvered the fields in the mornings. Outside, the world was preparing for its long sleep. In her cellar, Ilara felt the change. The air grew cooler, but it never developed the sharp, painful bite of the air on the surface. She placed a cheap thermometer she'd bought on a shelf. The temperature outside would drop to 20 degrees at night, but in her shelter, it held steady at a cool but life-sustaining 45. With a candle lit and her small camp stove for cooking, she could raise it to a comfortable 50. It was working. The constant, almost imperceptible current of air flowing from the pipe was her lifeline. It was not a roaring fire, but it was enough. It was the difference between freezing and survival. One afternoon, Thomas's black car appeared at the end of her lane. He had not come to see how she was. He had come to gloat. He saw the pile of dirt behind the barn and sneered. "What is this, Ilara? Are you trying to dig your own grave to save me the trouble? The first snow is in the forecast for next week. I expect you and your project to be gone by then. This is an eyesore. It devalues my property." "This is my property," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She held the deed to her worthless acre. "A piece of paper," he scoffed. "It won't keep you warm." He looked at her dirt-stained clothes and calloused hands, and for a moment his smug expression wavered, replaced by something like disgust. "You've become an animal, living in a hole." Liam would be ashamed. The mention of his name was a knife twist. But the pain was distant now. "Leave, Thomas," she said. He left, but his threat hung in the air. The first snow. It was no longer just a deadline from nature. It was a deadline from him. He would use it as an excuse to have her legally removed. The forecast was right. 3 days later, the sky turned the color of lead and the world went quiet. It was the deep, expectant hush that precedes a great storm. The air grew heavy and a few tentative flakes began to drift down, lazy and fat. Ilara took one last look at the whitening landscape, a world being erased. She checked on the sheep, ensuring their enclosure was secure and they had hay. Then she pulled a heavy, makeshift door of cross-braced planks over the entrance to her cellar, sealing herself in. The world outside disappeared. The only light was her lantern, casting a warm, golden glow on the wooden walls of her sanctuary. The only sound was the gentle whisper of air from the pipe and the muffled, distant shuffle of the animals above her head. She had stockpiled what she needed: tins of food, water, books she had saved from the house. She lit her small stove and heated Silas's wife's stew. It felt like a feast. The storm arrived not with a roar, but with a rising, insidious moan. The wind began to pick at the old barn, and she could hear the timbers groaning under the strain. Snow began to pile against her door, further sealing her in, insulating her from the chaos. For 2 days the storm raged. It was, the radio would later report, the worst blizzard in 50 years. A white hurricane that dropped 4 feet of snow and brought with it an Arctic cold that shattered records. Temperatures plummeted to 20 below zero, with wind chills that were deadly to any exposed skin. In her subterranean room, Ilara was calm. She read by lantern light. She slept soundly on her wooden platform, wrapped in her blankets. The air was cool, but it was a living cool, not the dead cold of the storm. She watched her thermometer. It never wavered. 45 degrees. The simple, elegant system held. The earth, the animals, and a piece of discarded stovepipe were holding the deadliest winter in a generation at bay. Meanwhile, in his sturdy, modern farmhouse, Silas was fighting a losing battle. The power had gone out on the first day. His backup generator had run for 12 hours before sputtering out, its fuel line frozen solid. His state-of-the-art propane furnace was useless. The temperature inside his house was dropping fast. It was 20 degrees, then 10. Then it was hovering near zero. Ice was forming on the inside of the windows. He and his wife were huddled in the kitchen, wearing every layer of clothing they owned, feeding their wedding furniture into the fireplace to stay alive. His greatest fear was for his livestock. He had a herd of prize-winning cattle in his new metal-sided barn, but the barn was designed for electricity, for heated water troughs and circulation fans. Without power, it was just a metal box. The water was frozen solid. The animals were lowing in distress, their breath turning to frost in the air. He knew if he couldn't get them water, he would lose them all. They would die of dehydration in the midst of a world made of frozen water. The irony was a bitter pill. Through the haze of exhaustion and growing panic, a thought surfaced. A memory of a woman in a hole in the ground, talking about sheep. "It won't freeze," she had said. It had sounded like madness then. Now, in the frozen tomb of his own modern home, it sounded like a prayer. He had to know. He bundled himself in his heaviest gear, his face wrapped until only his eyes were visible. He told his wife he was going to try to break the ice in the troughs. He didn't tell her where he was really going. He wasn't sure himself what he was doing. He stepped out into the storm and was immediately assaulted. The wind was a physical force, a wall of razor blades and ice. The snow was waist-deep, a thick, treacherous powder. The The 200 yards to Ilara's barn felt like an Arctic expedition. He fought for every step, leaning into the wind, his lungs burning with the frigid air. He could barely see, navigating by the ghost shape of the fence line. He thought more than once of turning back, that this was a fool's errand, a final, desperate act. But the image of her calm, stubborn face propelled him forward. He finally stumbled into the lee of the old barn, the wind lessening its assault. The building was caked in snow, looking more like a natural drift than a man-made structure. He found the cellar entrance, now just a depression in the snow. He began to dig with his gloved hands, his fingers quickly going numb. He shouted her name, the sound snatched away by the wind. Ilara. He clawed away the snow until he found the edge of her wooden door. He banged on it with his fist. Ilara. It's Silas. Let me in. For a long moment there was nothing. He thought perhaps he was too late, that she had frozen after all, that his conventional wisdom had been tragically correct. His heart sank. Then he heard a scraping sound from within. The door shifted, pushed open a few inches against the weight of the snow. A sliver of warm, yellow light cut through the blue twilight of the storm. He pushed his way through the opening and half fell down the steps, collapsing onto the earthen floor. He lay there for a moment, gasping, the relative warmth of the space a shocking, almost painful sensation against his frozen skin. He pulled off his mask, his beard caked with ice. The world he had entered was impossible. It was calm. It was quiet. Ilara was sitting on her cot, a book in her lap, looking at him with concern. A lantern cast a gentle glow. A small kettle was steaming on her stove. The air smelled of earth and wool and life. He pushed himself up and looked around, his eyes wide with disbelief. He saw the thermometer on the wall. The needle was steady, just a hair above 45 degrees. His gaze followed the stovepipe up to the ceiling. He could feel the faintest, gentlest current of air coming from it. It was not hot, but it was warmer than the air in the room. "How?" he whispered, the word a plume of white vapor. She just looked at him, her expression not triumphant, but simply patient. She had known. She had trusted something older and quieter than his modern certainties. "I'll be damned," Silas breathed, shaking his head in slow, profound wonder. He sank onto a wooden crate, the last of his skepticism dissolving in the impossible warmth of the mole woman's burrow. He was the first convert. The storm broke on the fourth day. The sun came out, glittering on a world transformed, buried and beautiful. The silence was absolute. The valley began to dig itself out. The news that trickled out over the next few days was grim. Several families had lost nearly all their livestock. 2 elderly men who lived alone on the high ridge had been found frozen in their homes. The great blizzard of that year became a landmark in time, a new point of reference for hardship. But a new story began to circulate as well. It started with Silas, who told everyone he met what he had seen. He described walking from his frozen, state-of-the-art house into Ilara's subterranean room and finding a small, calm pocket of survival. He told them about the pipe and the sheep and the steady, unwavering temperature. At first, people were incredulous. But Silas was a respected man, not given to flights of fancy. His word carried weight. And his own losses, half his herd, dead from dehydration, were a testament to the storm's fury. Curiosity replaced mockery. A few days later, a small procession of farmers made their way down Ilara's lane. They came not to stare or to pity, but to learn. She took them down into her shelter, one by one, and showed them what she had built. She explained the simple principles: the insulating power of the earth, the radiant body heat of the animals, the slow burn of the compost beneath them, and the simple pipe that connected the two worlds. They stood in her small, warm room, touching the walls, feeling the air from the pipe on their weathered hands, their faces a mixture of awe and chagrin. They had looked at this barn and seen only ruin. She had looked at it and seen a system. The name Mole Woman was forgotten. They started calling her the Barn Woman, or simply by her name, Ilara, but with a new tone of respect. Her simple, desperate act of survival had become a revelation. It was a piece of old wisdom, rediscovered by a woman with nothing left to lose. Thomas arrived a week later, his black car struggling through the rutted, icy road. He came not with an eviction notice, but with a bill. He claimed the storm had damaged the main farmhouse, and that, as a member of the family, she was somehow responsible for a share of the repairs. It was a pathetic, last-ditch effort to exert his power. He found her not alone, but standing with Silas and 2 other neighbors. They were helping her build a more permanent, insulated door for her shelter. They turned as he approached, 4 silent figures against the backdrop of the old barn. "You need to leave," Silas said to Thomas, his voice flat and hard. "This is her land. We won't have you bothering her." Thomas looked from Silas's stony face to the others, and he saw that the world had shifted. He was the outsider now. His money and his ledger meant nothing here. He had been defeated not by an argument, but by a simple, undeniable truth that had been proven in the heart of the blizzard. He got back in his car without another word and drove away. Ilara never saw him again. In the years that followed, Ilara did more than just survive. She thrived. Her small shelter became a model. That spring, Silas and his sons helped her expand it, building a proper pantry and a small workshop. They helped her construct a system to collect rainwater from the barn roof. She started a garden on her rocky acre, using the rich compost she dug out from the barn floor. Other families in the valley, having learned the hard lesson of the Great Blizzard, came to her for advice. The Ilara Cellar, as it came to be known, became a feature on many of the local farms. A low-cost, low-tech insurance policy against the brutal whims of winter. She never remarried. She lived out her days on her 1-acre plot, a respected and integral part of the community that had once scorned her. She was a quiet woman, not given to boasting. But her legacy was written into the very landscape, in the small, unassuming shelters dug into the earth, each one a testament to her vision. Years later, when people told her story, they would often focus on the ingenuity of the pipe or the cleverness of using the animal's warmth. But the true lesson was deeper. It was a story about the nature of value. Thomas, the townspeople, even the well-meaning Silas. They had all looked at the old barn and the rocky acre and seen nothing of worth. They saw only what was broken, what was missing, what had been lost. Ilara, with her back against the wall, had been forced to see things differently. She had looked at the same scene and had seen the integrity of the deep earth, the life in the feral sheep, the latent energy in the decay. She had seen not a collection of worthless things, but a system, waiting to be connected. Her story became a quiet legend in the valley, a reminder that the most powerful solutions are sometimes not found in new technologies or grand plans, but in listening to the subtle, ancient wisdom of the world. It is a story about the profound courage it takes to look foolish, to trust an observation that everyone else dismisses, and to dig for your life in a place that has been declared barren. For it is often in the places deemed worthless that the secrets to survival are buried, waiting for someone desperate enough and wise enough to bring them to the light.